Delivering the Impossible. Have you come to the right place? You got the right show? I did a version of this show at the Brighton Fringe, and about a quarter of an hour in, a gentleman whose command of English wasn't terrific managed to explain to me that he was in the wrong show, or I think he was in the wrong show. But delivering the impossible, right? What I'm going to do is, as an introduction, I'm going to ask and answer 4 questions. And you see, I've got some cards here. What I try and do is to keep the talk fresh, so it's not, I don't say exactly the same thing every day. I take these questions at the beginning in a different order every time, and also after that I'm going to talk about a bunch of different subjects, and there'll be a tiny little bit of audience participation, so you get asked to select a subject, but don't worry, nothing too heavyweight. And the first question that I'm going to ask and answer is, why now? Why should I be talking about this subject? The subject of this talk is project management and software development. Why should I be talking about it now? Well, actually, I think I'm talking about it a little too late, because the inspiration for this show, one of the inspirations for this show, is a quote from a chap called Mark Anderson. So Mark Anderson wrote something called Netscape, which is one of the first web browsers. Before you had Chrome, before you had Edge, even before you had Internet Explorer, you had this browser called Netscape. And Mark Anderson made a ton of money out of this. He made a lot of money out of it, and then he started his own investment company, and he invests in lots and lots of different tech shares, and he says lots and lots of things about technology. He's a kind of archetypal Californian Silicon Valley tech bro. And some of the things that he said recently are pretty peculiar. He recently said that it was immoral to oppose AI, even if AI was doing bad things, which is pretty peculiar. But something he said that really resonated with me was that software is eating everything. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that every aspect of our lives, to some degree, is starting to be moderated by software, controlled by software. If we want to get something to happen, we have to go and use some software. So this is kind of a very important thing. This is why I'm talking about this now. Examples of things where software is eating things. So, you know, if you want to eat, if you're hungry, you're probably going to order something via Deliveroo or Uber Eats. If you want to go out for a restaurant, you're probably going to look at some kind of review site. If you want love, or you just want to hook up, you're probably going to go via some kind of dating site like Tinder. If you're interested in politics, you're probably going to gain a lot of your ideas now about what's happening in politics and form your opinions through things like social media sites. If you're bored, you're probably going to be listening to Spotify, or you're going to be looking at Netflix. Lots and lots of different aspects of our lives are being consumed by software. And the other aspect of this is that the people who own those companies are some of the richest and most powerful people in the world. So people like Jeff Bezos, people like Mark Zuckerberg, people like Elon Musk. When Jeff Bezos got divorced from his wife became the richest woman in the world. That's how rich Jeff Bezos is, right? So these people are very, very powerful. And the tagline when I'm handing out leaflets for this show is a short talk on how to rule the world. And that is one way to rule the world, is to own the companies that write software. So that's why now, why this is an important thing now. Why me? Well, there are 2 aspects to this. There are 2 kind of answers to this question. The first is a kind of boring CV-style answer, which is, I've been involved in software development for 30 years. I've been involved in software development professionally for 30 years. I actually got my first computer when I was 12 years old. So I've been trying to write software badly. I've never been that good at it since I was 12. I've been involved in project management for about 20 years. The first project that I managed was writing software for, it was a dumb phone, it wasn't a smartphone, called the Nokia 9000, which was the size of a house brick. And everybody was very excited because you could sort of browse the web on it and you could sort of read email on it. And the 2 guys who I was managing, who were trying to write software for it, they lived in the former East Germany, and they'd learned how to code on Commodore 64 computers smuggled over the Berlin Wall, so they were very enthusiastic about writing software. But that job essentially consisted of consoling them when it turned out that the thing they were trying to do was much more complicated than they thought and was taking longer than they thought it would. And I've pretty much been doing that to various groups of software developers for the last 20 years. So that's the kind of boring CV answer. Why you should listen to me is that I've been doing this for a long time. But there's kind of another answer which I think is slightly more interesting and is probably the real answer. And I kind of came up with a good way of expressing this when I was checking into my accommodation for these 2 weeks that I've been here at the Edinburgh Fringe. So I'm staying in the university accommodation out at Polk Halls in Newington, and I was trundling up the road with my little suitcase, and I was thinking, well, this is quite exciting, isn't it? Checking into student accommodation, going to do something for a couple of weeks, probably not going to pay off directly financially, probably not going to lead to any direct work, and then kind of like a little voice in my head said, yes, but it's not as big a gamble as doing a 4-year philosophy degree, which was the first time I checked into student accommodation up the road in St Andrews. So I have a philosophy degree. I don't have a maths degree, I don't have an engineering degree or a computer science degree. And even so, I've managed to find work in computing for the last 30 years, and I tend to see things slightly differently. I know that I see things slightly differently because sometimes when I say things in meetings, people look at me very, very strangely, as if I'd said something really, really odd. I look at things differently. And looking at things differently is a central theme in this show. Why you? You may well be asking why you. You may be thinking, why the hell am I listening to this? I think there are 3 reasons why you should listen to this. I think there are 3 reasons why you should be interested in this show. The first one is, if you're involved in software development or project management, even if it's project management actually of things that aren't software development, I think you should be interested in what I have to say, because a lot of it applies to things that aren't really just software development. The second group is anybody whose kind of work environment or kind of their social environment is to some degree starting to become dependent on software, and that's an awful lot of people. One of the interesting things about working in project management for 20 years is that you see a lot of industries that have been eaten by software. So television, publishing, journalism, music, all of these industries where people are saying, no, software is never going to consume this industry. We can defend ourselves against it. Kind of people really like the smell of books, so digital books aren't going to take over, all those kinds of things. So if you're in one of those industries, you might not be directly connected with software, but if you're in one of these industries or walks of life where software is getting more important, I still think we should listen to what I have to say. And then there's a third group of people, and this is a bit cheeky, but I still think it applies. And the third group is everybody else. I think software is genuinely devouring everything, and so everybody in the modern world who lives in the modern world, they can probably get something valuable out of what I'm going to say. So there's a group of people in the Indian Ocean on an island. They're called the Sentinelese, and they don't want to speak to anybody. They don't want to be contacted as a tribe. There are quite a lot of photographs of the Sentinelese, and in all of these photographs, they're aerial photographs, and the Sentinelese are throwing spears at them and firing bows at them. They don't want to talk to anybody. That's fine. I'm not going to bother the Sentinelese. But everybody else, I think it's worth them listening to what I have to say. And finally, the final question before we move on to the kind of main part of the show is, why this? Why am I talking about software development and project management in the way that I am in this show? And I'm going to use another kind of inspirational quote for this, from a chap who's also a kind of tech bro from Silicon Valley, but from a previous generation. And this is a chap called Alan Kay. So Alan Kay used to work at this place called the Palo Alto Research Center in Palo Alto, California for Xerox. And what happened to Xerox was that in 1968, their patent for photocopying was going to run out. And Xerox had made a ton of money out of this. It was legendary that Xerox executives, they all travelled first class, they had lavish expense accounts. They knew that this gravy train was going to stop because the patent for photocopying was going to run out. And so they had a brilliant idea of how to fix this, which was to get 50, 100, I'm not exactly sure what the number was, but to get a lot of the smartest people in the world, pay them well, and put them in a laboratory and say, get on with it, invent some smart stuff. And what they invented was pretty much everything that we now think of as the personal computer. So the graphical user interface was invented there. The mouse, Doug Engelbart, who invented the mouse, worked at Palo Alto Research Center. Ethernet and networking, that happened there. Laser printing, PDFs, PDFs and all of that stuff that happens with Adobe, that was all stuff that was invented at Palo Alto. The interesting thing is that Xerox didn't really manage to use any of this stuff because they were kind of wanting a better photocopier, but that's a separate story. Alan Kay was the inventor of something that's very important if you know anything about software development, which is object-oriented programming. And he said something, I think it's in his history of object-oriented programming that I read. He said, point of view is worth 80 IQ points. So what did he mean by that? What did he mean that point of view is worth 80 IQ points? What he meant was, if you can look at something in the right way, you can be much more smart about how you deal with it, how you interact with it. So if you can look at a problem in the right way, you can be 80 IQ points smarter. Now for most of us, 80 IQ points is the difference between being a normal person and being a genius. So if you can look at something in the right way, you can be a genius. Of course, there's a downside to this, which is if you look at something in the wrong way, then you can be an absolute idiot about it, because if you take away 80 IQ points from most of us, then we're pretty dumb. So looking at things in the right way is one way of helping to solve problems. So that's the inspiration of the quote from Alan Kay. But also there's another aspect to this, which is for a while now been trying to write a book about project management and software development, and there is a book with the same title as this show, Delivering the Impossible. And when I started to do that, what I started to realize was I didn't like the project management books that said there is this one way to be successful at managing projects. I didn't like those kinds of books, especially when they kind of implied, well, if you follow this way really, really carefully, you're going to be successful. And if you're not successful, it's because you haven't really followed this way carefully enough. I didn't like that kind of vibe. And I was very attracted to the idea of thinking about different ways of looking at project management. And the idea that kind of in some situations, looking at them in one way would be most helpful, and then in another situation, looking at them in a different way would be more helpful. And so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to look at project management in this talk in a bunch of different ways. And as I said, to keep this fresh for me, but also fresh for the audience, I don't decide exactly which of these topics I'm going to use each time. I kind of use some audience participation. So fortunately, I've still got some audience today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer, could you pick one of these? Okay, that one, right? Swamp. Okay. So, imagine that somebody has asked you to build some houses, and the place that you've been asked to build these houses isn't what you imagine would be an ideal place for these houses, a green field. It's a swamp. What aspects of that environment are you going to have to concern yourself with when you think about building houses there? Well, first of all, because when you imagine a swamp, you imagine that there's water and there's vegetation. You might have to think about what's under that water and vegetation. Is it rock? Is it clay? Is it sand? There's the basic geology of the place. What's going on underneath what you can see? And then on top of that, there's the water. Where's the water coming from? Can the water be redirected? Does this place flood at certain times of the year? Is it 15 feet deep rather than like a couple of inches deep? There's the kind of, I don't know what you call that, the hydrology, the waterology of it, right? So kind of like what's going on with the geology, and then what's going on with the water. And then beyond that, the things that you can see. So you can see plant life, and probably you might be able to see animal life as well. Birds, there might be frogs, there might be insects, etc. So all of this stuff you're going to have to worry about. Are you allowed to get rid of this environment? Are these endangered newts? Nearly always when people try and build anywhere there's virgin land, there's some endangered newts, right? So there might be all sorts of different kind of wildlife, rare insects, rare butterflies, plants that only grow in this one particular bog, all sorts of things like that that are going on. And this is just the geology and the water and then the plant life. Now we get to the humans. Are there any humans here? Does anybody live on this land? What do they think about you coming and building something here? If the people who live on this land aren't the people who own this land, what is your relationship with the owners? You're probably going to think that the owners are the people who ask you to build on this land, but maybe it might be a more complicated relationship than that. So the people who live there, they're the people who own the land. There might be people who want to live here. Who are you building this for? Who are you trying to sell this for once you kind of manage to build something here? So there are people who don't live here already that might want to live here. So there's lots of people involved. Beyond that, there's regulation. So this land will be somewhere. It will be in an area, a local area that has local regulations. It will be inside a country, and the country will have national regulations. So there might be people who never intend to come and live here, don't own the place, don't live there, but still have ideas and notions about what should go on in this place. And beyond that, beyond regulators and residents and geology and the water and the plants, etc., there may be other people, because this is a site of special scientific interest, or it's like regarded as an ecological site that needs to be saved, that don't have any of those interests. They don't own it, they don't live there, they're not part of the government that controls it, but they still have opinions about what should be going on in that space. Something very similar is happening when you try and do a project. Most projects are not in a greenfield space. They're inside a complex environment that has all those kinds of things. There are analogues for all those kinds of things that I've talked about going on inside most organizations. And so part of what you have to do when you're trying to build something inside a swamp / organization is to understand as much as you can about what that complexity is and what is actually popular in that organization, possible inside that organization, and what isn't possible inside that organization. Now, there are several things that you can do that tend to get missed when people focus on just doing the things that people have asked for initially in a project. One of those things is, it's sometimes called user research, but it's more kind of like organizational research. It's trying to find out what is actually going on in the organization, what are the power plays that are going on, what are the different currents that are going on, why is this project being brought into play at all, who benefits from it, who doesn't benefit from it, who is threatened for it, all of that kind of stuff. You might find that out through user research, but you might also have to pay attention and do a little bit of espionage to really find out what's going on inside the organization. So that's one thing that you have to do. The other thing that you have to do, or you can do, is you can produce working software. You can produce something that does a bit of the thing that this project is supposed to do. And then you can start to try and deploy this. You can start to try and either use it inside the organization or use it outside the organization. And what is absolutely certain is that if you try and do this, if you try to get actual working software deployed either inside the organization or outside the organization to real users, you will find out a ton about the organizational structure of this organisation, this swamp. And also you'll find out a lot about those external regulators outside of the organisation who don't actually live in the swamp, never visit it, but still have lots and lots of opinions about it. So this is kind of like a fundamental theme in my book, is that the environments in which we do projects are complex. And in order to understand how they're complex, we have to do kind of experimentation and probing. Very often projects are kind of sketched as just a list of things to do. You get through this list, you get on with it, and then you're done. But so often the shortest point between, the quickest route between 2 points in a swamp is not a straight line, and you have to understand that. Okay, so that was swamps. I'll spread these out again, and we'll have a glamorous audience member pick another card. Okay. Escape. So this is really interesting because it's very, very closely related to the previous one. This is basically the idea I've just talked about with working software, that there's an idea in kind of one approach to doing software development and project management, which is kind of agile. There's an idea of trying to get working software as early as possible. And in my experience, this meets enormous amounts of resistance. And it means enormous amounts of, it's one of the few things that senior management and people who work in the teams are kind of agreed on, that they don't want to do this. They don't want to get something small working and release it out to either the public or some kind of internal group. And I think the reason that they don't want to do it is because very often these things that are not the finished product, they're kind of embarrassing because they don't do all the things that initially the product was supposed to be doing. They don't have the promise of doing that. They don't deliver on the promise of what the project is going to do. So that's kind of embarrassing. The second thing is that they very often, when you actually produce something like this, the project might have been going quite a long time by the time you get to the point where you've got something that you can actually release. And so this thing looks fabulously expensive because, like, say it's taken you a third of the project to get to the point where you've got anything that you can show people, then, and the project's costs £1 million, you've got 300,000 quid and you've got maybe a couple of screens and a button or something. I've seen that happen, right? I've seen projects get to the point where you've spent 200,000, 300,000 pounds and you have the first demo of some working software and it's a single page. You press a button. When you press a button, you get an error, and the error is spelled incorrectly, right? It's embarrassing, right? So this is why naturally kind of developers and the people who paid for the project and senior people kind of instinctively avoid this. But what is the value of doing it? What is the value of getting software out into the wild, or as near the wild as possible? Well, there are two really, really important aspects of this. One is that by trying to get the software out, whereas we talk with the swamp, by trying to get the software as near to escape, as near to kind of real people as possible, you find out about all these tripwires and kind of traps and kind of booby traps and all this kind of stuff that stops you. You find out about what it is in the organization that's going on that would stop you. And this is really, really important information. It's good to learn this early on rather than late. That's one thing. But the other thing is really, I was going to say subtle, but it's not subtle. But it's something that very often people really struggle with inside projects. And that is that if you can connect this thing to people who actually value it, you completely change the dynamic of a project. Because you change a project from being just a list of things that need to be done and delivered to something that people have actually seen they've had in their hands and they want. There's a wonderful quote from a chap called Arthur C. Clarke, famous science fiction writer. He said, "Sufficient technology is indistinguishable from magic." And the way that people react and use actual working software is as if it was magic. They react to it completely differently than to a list of features. And so an example of how this has really worked in my favour in the past. I worked on a project, and this project was for the government, and it was a document system for a bunch of administrators inside government departments. And we had lots and lots of trouble, and it was that example that I just talked about, where the first bit of working software had a button, and when you press the button you got an error. It was that project. And not long after that demonstration, we had something that was kind of, it worked poorly, it did the document management thing, but it didn't work very well. And we had somebody who was acting as a kind of liaison between the organisation and the users. And she'd been an administrator herself, and she saw this working software, and she said, "Can you put that on a laptop for me so I can take it out and I can show it to the administrators?" And we said, "Yeah, sure, we can do that." And so she took this software that still had lots of problems, it still had user interface problems, it ran slowly sometimes, it still had spelling mistakes. And she took that and she showed it to her colleagues, her former colleagues, who were administrators in these government departments. And the thing that she could do, that kind of we couldn't do because we were the supplier and she was like a friend to them, is she could say, "Oh yeah, don't worry about that bit, that's going to get fixed. Look at this is what it can do, and imagine if it could do this." And what we did by doing that is we connected to the people who actually wanted to use the software. And the result of that was that we got a wave from them of demand for particular things that they liked. We got feedback on things that they didn't care about at all. And we also got demand to actually get the thing being used. And so that's the most important aspect of getting your software to escape, is that if you can put it in the hands of people who are actually going to use it, you completely change the dynamic of what the project is. You take it away from a list of things to be delivered to a thing that is actually already being valued and used. Just one final thing about this is, very often, let's say you've got 100 things on this list, 10 of them are the things that the users really, really want. And if you can find out what those things really are, and you can give them to users, then you can off the races. This talk is called Delivering the Impossible. You're on the way to delivering something that's possible, what people actually want. Okay. Final one. I think that's the final one. We'll see, but I think it is. Stream. So it's interesting that all of these today are all very closely connected. In order to really explain this one, I have to go back and talk about the Japanese car industry. So, Toyota started building cars in the late 20s, early 30s. Japan at that time was a very different economy from Japan now. It was very, very cyclical, and it was very, very small. And so when Mr. Toyoda, with a D, who made sewing machines at that point, decided he was going to start making cars, he went and visited America, and he went and visited the Ford factory, and he saw that the way that Ford made cars, which is mass production, make as many cars as you possibly can, and economies of scale and all that kind of stuff. And he realized that that wasn't something that could work in Japan, because there simply wasn't the demand, and when there wasn't the demand was very cyclical. Sometimes it was up, sometimes it was down. And so he put Toyota on a path which they've kind of held on to for certainly a substantial part of their history, which was to make cars at the rate of demand. There's a wonderful book called The Toyota Production System by a chap called Taiichi Ohno, and he talks about this, about trying to make cars at the rate of demand. And the kind of wonderful focus they had on this made them also start to realize that there were other aspects of this that they could like improve in the way that they produce cars. So they started to focus on only doing things on the production line for the car that were actually adding value. So anything that they were doing would be adding value to the car, and other kinds of things that didn't add value, they tried to not do. So an example of something that might go on in a factory that doesn't add value is piling up parts in anticipation of them being used. And so they focused on not doing that, and they ended up with something that you've probably heard of, which is called just-in-time manufacture. Right? So they focused very much on having a production line, and at every stage in the production line, something of value is being added. Why do I know about this? I know about this because in the 80s, American cars were terrible. And Japanese cars were cheaper and more reliable, and they were beating the Americans at car manufacture and car sales. And so this resulted in people who worked in business schools in America starting to go to Japan and look at what they were doing in Japan and trying to explain why the Japanese were so much better than the Americans at making cars. And they came up with this idea of the value stream. A value stream is this kind of set of stages where value gets added, and the result at the end is a car. And certainly in Japan, Toyota can set things up so that essentially the manufacture of a car is triggered by an order in the showroom, and that car gets pulled off the production. This is a value stream. The irony here is I'm talking that, so this is a way of seeing, right? This is a way of seeing, thinking about things in terms of value stream. But the irony is that the reason I'm talking about this is because this is a terrible way of thinking about software development. In software development, we're building an entirely new product. And when we're building frequently, almost always, we're building an entirely new product. And when we're building a new product, this is very, very different from what Toyota are doing, which is they're making a mature product. So if you're going to look at software development in terms of a value stream, what you have to realize is this value stream doesn't exist. On a software development project, you have to put that value stream together. You have to understand which bits happen, and then what happens after that, and which bit is it really important that it's fast, and which bit is it really important that it's cheap. All of those things that have been done when you make a car, you have to put all of these things together to actually put together the value stream for a new product. So all of those things I've been talking about when I was talking about Escape, about connecting with the customer and understanding what it is they value and what it is they don't value, is part of actually constructing that value stream. So you have to kind of irrigate your own value stream. That's what you have to do when you're creating a new product. But it's worse than that, because you have this value stream that you have to build, but that value stream is competing against a kind of weird mystical value stream, which is whatever happened to get the idea funded. And what that value stream is nearly always, to the people who are actually delivering the project, opaque. Sometimes it's obvious because it's like there's a government regulation that says we have to do this, or our competitors have got it and so we have to have it. But very often, whatever it is that caused the funding to happen, and this is a separate value stream, this is a mysterious value stream, isn't obvious. Ideas, the kind of ideas that get funded, often have in them some kind of all, same, everything, forever type kind of thing. So they have something that makes them shiny, basically. Ideas, so kind of, this is going to do exactly what the old system did. That's kind of all. And then often they have something else to kind of make them slightly exciting, but it's going to do it differently, or it's going to do it faster, or it's going to be cheaper, or whatever, right? So that's the kind of rhetorical appeal that got the idea funded. But once you start to build the real thing, you start to find out real world problems with constructing the value stream. Some aspect of the value stream is just way too complicated and can't really be done in time. Another aspect of the value stream is not valued by the customers. Like, it's not something that they actually care about. Another bit of the value stream is just too expensive to do. And that attacks the shiny, shiny idea. And this is kind of inherent tension that you're dealing with almost always in the heart of doing the project management. You're dealing with this kind of tension. And in reality, the only way to kind of get out from this tension and get to a point where you've got any chance of success is the thing that I talked about when I talked about escape, which is getting some kind of contact with real customers. Until you've got contact with real customers and you've got at least the potential of generating real value and starting to see how actually the value stream might line up, then you're always going to be struggling, because the people who got the kudos and the support for the idea are going to be vulnerable, and when they're vulnerable, they're going to try and shut you up, they're going to try and shut you down. That is value stream. So what I've done now, and this is going to be interesting because I have such a small audience. Well, first of all, any comments or questions?
Very interesting.
Okay, so what I've done, I was doing a version of this online, and somebody who talks a lot about project management for a living was saying, yeah, but it's not fair doing this unless you've got some hecklers. And I said, okay, so I wrote some kind of what I thought were slightly challenging questions, and he said, yeah, they're not real heckles. So what I'm going to do is, I've got some heckles here, and I'm going to ask you to try and ask them as kind of like enthusiastically and firmly as possible. And some of them, what does it say?
Or something else incoherent.
So this is a very good point, yes. This is somebody who's managed to turn up to an Edinburgh show at early afternoon drunk, which is possible. And so this is kind of like an drunken incoherent heckle. These are more common at stand-up comedy shows, but kind of like, we'll take it for a kind of informational spoken word show like this. In response to that, I think I'd say, yes, I can understand why you're responding to this show incoherently, because I think a lot of what I've said doesn't necessarily line up. That's a point of what I'm making. That kind of, if you want to try and make a coherent talk, a fully coherent explanation of what is going on in project management, I think that's very difficult, and you end up with something that's quite fragile and brittle. What I've tried to do by talking about different subjects is to give you ways of thinking about this without necessarily prescribing which ones of these that you use. And also, I do have some specific suggestions, like maybe stick to soft drinks until after dinner. And so kind of like we'll have another one.
Okay.
We're going to have time for all of these, I think, because it's gone by quite quickly without a bigger audience. And we've got 4 of these left, so.
Okay, can I give you that one back? Let's go for another one. Okay, we're a bit bored. Why don't you tell us a joke?
Okay, so when I started doing this show, I had the idea that I was going to put lots of jokes in it, and somehow I really struggled to do that. And maybe that's something I have to work on. I did have a joke that was specific to the question at the beginning of why you, which is that I kept having these dreams that I was driving past billboards, and in the background of these billboards, I could see myself in these billboards, these advertisements, and I found this deeply, deeply disturbing. And I talked to my therapist about it, and she said that I have imposter syndrome.
Ooh. Okay. Maybe not tell us a joke.
Okay.
Okay, let's take
That one?
left one. Can I give you back
Yeah.
that. Well, that's all right, but really, all this is shit.
Yes, this is shit. This is a point that often gets made to me. I think it's similar to what I said to the gentleman who's fallen asleep now. They possibly had too much to drink. I think like there are ways that you can kind of heckle and attack what I've been saying. You know, I'm not offering 100% solutions. I'm just offering different ways of seeing things. But I think like part of, if you buy even any tiny little bit of what I said about the swamp, which is that it's a complicated space, one of the things about complicated spaces, or arguably complex spaces, is that they can't be seen in just one way. You can't just look at them in one way. And part of the problem, I think, with looking at project management, the traditional ways of looking at project management, even some of the ones that kind of think they're more advanced and more kind of like forward thinking, is that they tend to think about things in just one way. Very often the one way is that what's being asked of is a simple thing. It's just a set of stages that need to be gone through, a set of things that need to happen. And if only all those things happen, then the project will be successful. And a lot of what I spend my time doing, I think, as a project manager, and now I'm doing on stage, is saying it's more complicated than that. There are different ways of looking at it, and these different ways of looking at it will give you different kinds of benefit. And also, you remember I said that like I found it kind of really annoying that some people are suggesting if you just follow this one way, then you'll be successful. Some projects don't succeed. Some projects have got in them something inherently that means they don't succeed. Some of them manage to escape, they manage to connect with an audience, and the audience are interested. Okay, one or two more.
Okay. Well, you've been talking for quite a while now, but what is it that you don't know?
I had an answer for this, which I've said before, but I'm not sure it's entirely true. But what I used to say for this is, what I don't know is why it's so complicated. But I think I do know why it's so complicated. I think I'm starting to come up with an answer for why it's so complicated, why it's so complex. And that's because part of the kind of horse trading that happens to get the shiny idea funded is pretending things are simpler than they are. And that actually causes a lot of problems. So I do kind of know why it's complex. Here's something I don't know. I don't know why I'm on a stage talking about it. I don't know why I've decided this is an approach, especially today, I suppose. I don't know why I'm on a stage talking about it. I think part of it is to get my ideas clear, but also I think part of the idea is to say this clearly, possibly to a different audience. So now by developing this talk, I've got something that I can take, you know, I can take the show on the road, I can give this at different places. So maybe that's why I'm talking about it, rather than writing about it, or as well as writing about it. Okay, one final one, we've got 1 minute left. Thank you.
Well, all this is your own opinion. None of the things that you've been talking about is actually scientifically proven. What you've got to say about that?
This is absolutely true. Some of the things I've been talking about, they have sort of a scientific basis in that they're talking about looking at the world, so they have a kind of empirical basis. But if you have a strict kind of scientific view of kind of what things can be proved and what things can't be proved, then nothing of what I've said really comes under that. I think, but it's interesting that this is not, project management is not something which has kind of succumbed to science. It's not something that we understand what the algorithm for managing projects is, we can apply that algorithm and then everything's fine. We're still not at that stage. And because we're still not at that stage, I think it's worth experimenting with lots of different ideas. Thank you very much. You've been a wonderful audience.
Yay! Well done.
Well,